In the smoldering ruins of a city literally erased from the map, the war was over, but the dying wasn't. A new kind of death had just been unleashed on the world. It was silent, it was invisible, and it was absolutely terrifying. This is the story of that death, of the people who suffered through it, and the forbidden truth one man risked everything to tell. So these are the words of an Australian journalist, Wilfred Burchett. They were sent by Morse code from Hiroshima on September 5th, 1945. And they landed like a second shockwave. You see, the official story was all about a clean, decisive victory, one terrible blast that ended the worst war in human history. But Burchett's report, it told a totally different story. A full month after the Enola Gay flew away, a mysterious illness was stalking the survivors. People who had walked away from the blast, seemingly okay, were now just collapsing in the streets, dying in agony. The world knew a bomb had fallen, sure, but it had no idea about the lingering radioactive horror it had left behind. So what was this atomic plague? Well, in those chaotic weeks right after the bombing, the doctors on the ground were completely baffled. They were staring at a clinical nightmare they had no name for, a sickness that just defied all medical understanding at the time. It didn't follow any known patterns of disease or injury. It was like a poison that attacked the body from the inside, turning its own systems against itself. The people suffering from this plague are known in Japan as the Hibakusha, and that term is devastatingly precise. It literally means explosion-affected people, a name that forever ties their identity to that one single blinding moment. They weren't just survivors of a bombing. They became carriers of its invisible, deadly legacy, marked for life by an event the rest of the world was already trying to move on from. Doctors saw patient after patient with the exact same ghastly progression. First, it would start with this severe sickness. Then, these telltale purple spots would just bloom beneath the skin. That's subcutaneous bleeding, a sign the body's integrity was failing. Hair would fall out in clumps, gums would bleed and just not stop. And then this deep, unshakable weariness would set in, kind of the body's final surrender before a terminal fever took over. This was acute radiation sickness, and for those seeing it for the first time, it was a medical horror show. And you have to remember, all of this was happening against a backdrop of devastation that's almost impossible to imagine. Burchett's description here is just hauntingly spot on. For miles in every direction, there was almost nothing left. The physical destruction was absolute, a landscape of ash and ghosts. But in a lot of ways, that invisible plague, the radiation poisoning the air, the water, the earth, was so much more terrifying than the blast itself. It was a threat you couldn't see, you couldn't fight, and you absolutely could not escape. Now, here's the thing. The world wasn't supposed to know about any of this. The official story was simple. A powerful new weapon ended the war. Period. Lingering, agonizing deaths from an invisible poison, that just did not fit the triumphant narrative. But one journalist decided the truth on the ground was way more important than the story being crafted by men in power. On September 2nd, while all the world's press was on the deck of the USS Missouri watching the formal surrender of Japan, Wilfred Burchett just slipped away. He got on a train for a grueling 20-hour ride south, into a forbidden zone, completely defying military orders that had made Hiroshima off-limits to all reporters. He got to the flattened city on September 3rd, and he didn't focus on the twisted steel. He went to the overflowing hospitals, he listened to the doctors and the dying, and then he sat on a block of rubble with his little typewriter and wrote the story that would become the scoop of this century, sending it by Morse code all the way to London just to get around the Allied censors in Tokyo. And this is the crucial point. Before Burchett's story, the public conversation was all about the bomb's explosive power, right? How many tons of TNT it equaled. He completely changed the game. His report introduced these terrifying new concepts, radiation sickness and nuclear fallout, to a global audience for the very first time. And that was a huge embarrassment for the US military, which have been so careful to control every piece of information coming out of Japan. Well, you can imagine, the official response was swift and it was severe. An institutional wall of denial went up almost overnight. The goal was simple, and it was ruthless. Discredit the eyewitness, control the narrative, and erase the story of the atomic plague before it could really take hold. I mean, just look at the chasm between the reality on the ground and the official story. While Burchett is reporting on people vomiting blood, the New York Times is running headlines quoting military sources saying, "No radioactivity in Hiroshima ruin." General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, just flatly dismissed all of it as Japanese propaganda. And when Burchett later confronted another official with what he'd seen with his own eyes, he was told point blank, "I'm afraid you've fallen victim to Japanese propaganda." The extent of this disinformation campaign is it's genuinely shocking. In testimony before the US Senate, General Groves went so far as to claim that death from radiation poisoning was without undue suffering. And then he added this chilling line. In fact, they say it is a very pleasant way to die. It was a complete, clinical, total denial of the agonizing reality that was playing out hour by hour in Hiroshima's hospitals. And this wasn't just a few misleading statements. No, this was a systematic, four-part strategy of silence. First, you restrict all access. Second, you actively suppress any story that does get out. Another journalist managed to write a 25,000-word story from Nagasaki, and the censors just killed it. Never saw the light of day. Third, you publicly discredit anyone like Burchett who breaks through. They even took his camera and film. And finally, you promote your own story, paying a different journalist to write officially sanctioned articles that specifically denied radiation sickness was even a thing. But underneath all those layers of denial and censorship, there was another hidden story, a real tragedy within a tragedy. You see, the victims of the bomb weren't all Japanese. For tens of thousands of them, the horror of the blast was compounded by a cruel and systemic injustice that had started long before any bomb ever fell. Out of all the victims of the bombings and their aftermath, a staggering 100,000 were Korean. Just think about that for a second. That's roughly 1 out of every 7 victims. And most of them weren't in Japan by choice. They were forced laborers and conscripts under Japan's brutal colonial rule. So they were victims of Japanese imperialism, who then became victims of the American atomic bomb. The Korean survivors themselves came up with a name for this, the double bomb. The first bomb was the literal atomic blast that destroyed their bodies. The second bomb was the discrimination they faced right after. As non-Japanese nationals in a shattered country, they were just pushed to the back of the line, their suffering ignored, their basic human rights denied. And this slide, it shows just how deadly the consequences of that discrimination were. In the chaos right after, medical facilities prioritized Japanese victims. Koreans were often just turned away. Look at the difference in the mortality rate, 57.1% for Koreans, way higher than the average. Decades later, Japan created a medical care law for its survivors in 1957. Korea wasn't able to do the same for its survivors until 2017. That's a gap of 60 years. And if Korean survivors did manage to get home to Korea, they were immediately cut off from any Japanese government benefits. For all Hibakusha, Japanese and Korean alike, just surviving the bomb was only the beginning of a lifelong struggle. The physical scars were horrific, yeah, but the social and psychological fallout would haunt them, their families, and their children for decades to come. In their own communities, rumors started spreading that the atomic plague was contagious. So survivors were shunned, they were feared, they were isolated. But the deepest, most painful stigma was around marriage. Families were afraid of the Hibakusha blood, believing it would cause birth defects in the next generation. So many survivors were rejected as partners, while countless others chose to hide their past, just to protect their own children's futures. Finding a job was a constant struggle, and they faced this agonizing private dilemma of whether it was even safe or fair to bring children into the world. And then the Americans came with the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, or ABCC. Its mission? To study the long-term effects of radiation. Tens of thousands of survivors were regularly examined. But here was the catch. The commission had a strict and deeply controversial policy: study only, no treatment. So survivors would be brought in for these invasive tests, their illnesses would be documented in incredible detail, and then they'd be sent home with no medical care whatsoever, even for the life-threatening conditions the ABCC had just found. This quote from a survivor, Mineko Do-o, just perfectly captures that feeling of profound dehumanization. For so many Hibakusha, it felt like they weren't being treated as patients who needed help, but as living lab rats. They were just data points in a long-term science experiment, their suffering meticulously observed, but never, ever helped. And this struggle for recognition, for basic care, is still going on. Today, there are around 250,000 officially acknowledged Hibakusha, and yet the Japanese government officially recognizes less than 1% of them as having what it calls atomic bomb disease, a specific legal status that gets you a special medical allowance. For the other 99%, while their cancers, their organ disorders, their lifelong sicknesses are, in the eyes of the government, officially unrelated to the radiation they endured.
You know, the story of the atomic plague is so much more than a dark chapter in a history book. It's a story about the devastating human cost of a weapon, about the dangerous power of official stories to shape reality, and it's a warning that was first shouted out nearly 80 years ago. And so we end right where we started, with Wilfred Burchett's words typed out in the middle of a dead city. He didn't see his report as just a news story, a scoop for the front page. He saw it as a desperate message to the future, a warning to a world that had just recklessly unlocked the power of the atom. His hope was that by showing the true, lingering horror of this new weapon, humanity would be forced to really confront what it had created. But his warning was suppressed. The stories of the Hibakusha were silenced for decades, their suffering denied, ignored, or just studied with this cold detachment. And so we're left with a final, unavoidable question. 80 years later, with thousands of nuclear weapons still pointed all across the globe, has the world truly, really heeded their warning?